Rewind.
So back on the rewind, we're going to be looking at early medieval. And when we talk about early medieval, we've got to chuck in the Vikings here somewhere. And I thought that we would have a nice little look at some images. And we would probably do a little bit of a stab with Viking sites in good old Cymru, Wales. We'd have a couple of mentions about the Vikings elsewhere. And we're going to look at something very unusual as well. And it changes the aspect of the Vikings being lustful, blood-curdling warriors that were indestructible. So that's a clue. And we're going to look at a location that I've mentioned before. It's the island of Sanday, and a certain burial on the island of Sanday, which will be familiar to some of you, but some of the images might not be. And this is actually from, this is the guard and the hilt of the sword found with the Sanday Scar ship burial. So that's what that is. Well, obviously, I don't think anyone would have guessed that. I think the problem is that the guard itself, when you look at it, and if I can get my annotation in there, you've got this nice little bit of a hilt here.
Can you get rid of this recording bit?
What recording bit? Oh, you've got to press you agree.
What?
Apparently when it says, do you want this recorded, you've got to press yes or no.
Just continue or leave meeting.
Continue.
Continue.
Yeah. Oh, it's a bit of a pain, isn't it? Well, Americans usually are a bit of a pain. Right. So in other words, talking about the guard and the hilt, and obviously the rest of the rest of the sword itself is in a really bad condition. So hence why you weren't able to identify this artifact. But we'll actually come back to this artifact. I don't do any more about this now. So again, it was a bit of a pseudo trying to put something together about the Vikings that made them seem different than what you had heard before. And this is an image that some of you may be familiar with. It's actually from Weymouth Harbour. And what they found at Weymouth Harbour was a number of decapitated individuals. And these individuals weren't Angles and Saxons. They weren't ancient Britons. They weren't Romans. These are actually the remains of a group of Vikings that were captured and then beheaded. So that paints a different picture already. It's sort of, these indestructible Vikings are not as indestructible as history paints them to be. Whenever you think about the Vikings, you think about Lindisfarne, and you're thinking about the raping and pillaging in connection with the monastery at Lindisfarne in the year 793, the harrying from those from the north, and so on. It sort of paints that picture. However, what we do know is most descriptions about the Vikings, including that description, was either made at home or away. It's usually secondary sources. And when we've got these programs on television called the Vikings, we always see these indestructible Vikings on television, and we see that wonderful Kirk Douglas in the Vikings. Boo-hoo! So we all remember that, yeah. So I just wanted to sort of teet us back a little bit. I'm going to put a little bit of a map in front of us, and probably leave a lot more to the imagination. However, this is an interesting bone before we actually get there. I've actually got a really interesting article that I'm going to scroll up on the screen and sort of do the little bits of caption, showing you some bones, showing you a few skulls that have breakages on them and so on. And this itself is a very interesting bone. And this is a a femur, and look at that. You can imagine that the bone is actually seeping. There's actually pus constantly coming out of the marrow of the bone, and this is actually one of the Vikings that was actually buried with the rest of the Vikings at Weymouth. So they weren't. Some of these Vikings weren't very healthy at all. A bad diet, and this is what we see in connection with these Vikings at Weymouth. So again, how do I put the Vikings into an early medieval, dark age, Arthurian? How do I put them into that sort of category to sort of link in with the rest? The one thing that the Vikings do represent is change, a different people, a different sort of sense of influence, and when we look at the hogback burials in connection with Cumbria that we've seen in the past and we've mentioned as well, that sort of takes you to that sort of Viking sort of sense and mindset. But I think one of the biggest problems that we've got in British archaeology is we always like to put things into categories, don't we? We always like to say Roman period or the Romans, or we like to say the Viking period and the Vikings, and the Anglo-Saxon period and the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans and so on. And when we start to put things into categories, everything else goes out the window. In other words, the Vikings turn up, where's everybody else? They must have disappeared. When the Romans turn up, who was living in Britain? Nobody other than the Romans, when in fact the reverse is in fact the case. And in some ways, that's what I want to think about today.
That bone looks like it's been damaged and has healed again. There's evidence of osteoclast building up in various areas on that particular bone.
But Pete, you've got to agree, the person with that limb must have been in absolute bloody agony.
Yeah.
I don't, Pete. I don't know what it must be like, because let's just zoom in on that hole, right? That hole, that hole itself is there's 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Right, and the vesicles themselves, which are the space between the sort of cellular growth of the bones, they're quite large as well. So there's obviously regrowth and there's lots of osteo problems. But this person's wandering around on this, and it's just oozing out as the person's walking. I can't imagine what that would be like. I can't imagine. The smell must have been intolerable. And obviously,
but it would have been covered by muscle and skin.
It would have been, but it would have been a seeping sore nevertheless.
Yes.
And again, what I wanted to do was to sort of give you another perspective. So these ain't these lanky, thin Vikings that all look like Andy with blonde hair. Some of these had crippling problems, crippling diseases. And these guys, they all look pretty nice and all pretty fetching. But the one thing that we can sort of say is that to try and get to Britain, you need a boat, right? So everything that we see in regards to Britain, you need a boat to get over here from 8,000 years ago onwards. So you've always needed a boat to get here. So in other words, whoever comes over to Britain is always going to be carried by a boat. But I think one of the massive influential things when we think about the Vikings are the boats. Right, but one thing that we don't think about is how did the Romans get over here? They didn't walk. They had the navy. They got over here by boats as well. But nobody really discusses that. The Anglo-Saxons, nobody really discusses their boats either. The Normans, other than the Bayeux Tapestry, you don't really see their boats being portrayed. But when you think about the Vikings, you see the boat being. It's like the symbol of the Vikings is in fact their boats. Undoubtedly, the longship, the oars. And then obviously the weird helmets with horns on them as well. But clearly one thing that you can see is none of these are actually got helmets on. They've got leather. They got leather caps basically. And it's easy to fight. It's probably easier to fight with a leather cap on. If it's really thick leather, you can probably take a blow from a sword. And that's an interesting point as well. So are the Vikings early medieval? Yes, they are. Are they sort of from the period of King Arthur? No. when do the Vikings actually come over here? That's the really big question. And the big question is probably we look at one image from a site known as Giles Hoft on Shetland. And when we think about the Vikings, we think that they came over here on a precise day, and in 793, and that's when they started to rape and pillage. And from the 800s, they're all over the place, and you've got the stories about Alfred the Great defeating the Vikings, and so on and so on, and then you've got to start thinking about what is the reality of the situation. And like the Romans, we'll forget the Normans, like the Romans and like lots of cultures, that there's usually some elements of influence coming over to Britain well before the period of the Vikings. So if you want to, okay, let me spit out what I'm talking about. So when you look at the Roman period, you look at AD 43, and you look at to 476. So that, or 410, or whatever dates you want to go with. But it's quite precise because you've got emperors and you've got dating things, and it's all written down, right? However, the Romans had already been settling and trading and in amongst us for 100 years before AD 43, right? So some in archaeology, what we like to do is do dates. We like to say something started here and then something started here. I noticed somebody was talking about the origins of human beings before we came on, and so on, and one of the things that you've got to think is that what came first, the chicken or the egg, and we'll never know the answer to that question. We might, however, even if we did, we wouldn't know the precise date. So, and the big question, the reason this is such a big topic, you see, within Cymru, Wales. But I mentioned Shetland. I mentioned the early influence of the Vikings in Britain, and I think the two clues to the Vikings are already in amongst us before the late 790s is when we look at the Sutton Hoo ship burial. Most people believe that the Sutton Hoo ship burial is Anglo-Saxon. There's a group of people who believe that the Sutton Hoo ship burial is actually British. Interesting. And there's my little group of people that would say that it's not an Anglo-Saxon ship burial from the 640s at all, or 630s, depending on which date you go with. It's maybe associated with Viking Swedish king. The word Radweld actually comes up, but you start to think, hang on a minute, what have I just said? The Sutton Hoo ship burial is possibly associated with the Viking Swedish king. So how is it Anglo-Saxon? It's probably Anglo-Saxon because it's buried in the British Anglo-Saxon period. It's not buried in the Viking period. The Viking period, as a period in time, doesn't occur until the 790s. And if some of you are thinking this is getting really confusing, archaeology and history is confusing. You know, there's never such thing as a layer in archaeology that you can really understand purely what's going on. So, say for example, somebody said, "Oh, what we're going to do, right? We're going to work out when the Romans precisely turned up at Vindolanda. We know they turned up on the 14th of August in 80 AD. But did they? Or did somebody have a camp there beforehand? You know, when do you begin something? It's like, in many ways, it's the same as when a relationship begins. You know, I don't think, not sounding personal, but I don't know when precisely I fell in love with Michelle, and I don't know when Andy can recall when he fell in love with his good wife Karen, and I don't know when Peter fell in love precisely when his wife. But we always have an anniversary when we actually got together. What happened leading up to that, we don't really know the sequence of events, and that's similar to the Vikings, for example. And the other one I want to mention is the Picts in Orkney. Pete knows this, and I know this, that when you go to Orkney, they they make a lot of fuss about the Vikings on Orkney. And you know, if me and Michelle were ever to go to Orkney and we organised a little trip, which could actually happen, by the way. You know, me and Michelle have discussed about going to Orkney and getting married, and then we'd meet a couple of you off the plane, and we'd take you around Orkney, and you would stay somewhere and whatever, right? But when you go around Orkney, what you do see is there's lots of links to do with the Vikings there. And then again, you look at the big cathedral on Orkney, Kirkwall Cathedral. We know that was founded associated with Saint Magnus in the year 1136, right? But the Vikings have been on Orkney for a very long time before that. It's possible that the Vikings are already on Orkney in the 600s, and they're not really seen across most of mainland Britain until the 790s, or until history actually records them. Now, this is a really interesting map, and I know that Jessica used this herself, and Jessica used this herself when she was looking at the Vikings, and I'm slightly distracted by Michelle in the background tottering along with a bucket full of water. But anyway, Jessica used this, and she was talking about Viking influence in Wales, in Cymru, and it's a really interesting map. And like many things with Cumbria, like many things with Cornwall, like many things with Cymru Wales, is that we don't have enough information and data about what's going on. In England we do, in Scotland we do, and in Shetland we have a better idea. And it's of no surprise that we're slowly starting to build up a really interesting picture of the Vikings being in Cymru Wales. And I think probably if you scratch the surface, you can actually see something very similar to Cumbria. And
they landed on Flatholm.
We know that they landed on Flatholm, but when? This is the point. When?
9:18.
But were they there before?
Afternoon.
No. I argue with you on that one. It's actually Wednesday, right? And you've got the calendar wrong. You've got the calendar wrong, Pete. And it wasn't Thursday afternoon at all. If you remember, Pete, we did the tides on this one. It was a morning tide. Thank you very much. You got that wrong. You know you had. But you know, Pete's made an interesting point. Actually, interestingly enough, Pete does open his big mouth. What we can see there is we can find the home, and there's another home as well, Steep Home as well. And you've got Grass Home, and you've got Skoke Home as well in West Wales.
All Scandinavian names.
All Scandinavian names. Now, when did they first call these places those names? And you're thinking really that the places like Flatholm and Steepholm and Grassholm and all these places called home, those would be the first places the Vikings would have gone to. And maybe what we might see is that the Vikings were around the coastline a lot earlier than we ever believed and ever thought. The Vikings were settlers. They wouldn't have settled on the best of land. And a clue to what's going on with the Vikings anywhere in Britain is that they're going to these little islands. And they're going to these little islands is because they were probably inhabited at the time. They were probably uninhabited at the time. And they were easy games to sort of shelter your vessel. But you couldn't have exactly sheltered an entire fleet around Flatholm. Maybe one or two vessels, and that would have been it. So what I'm getting at is that the early origins of the Vikings in Britain, we know a lot about their place names. We know, for example, of these names home, and it's likely as well that those names were coined maybe in the 900s or 1000s, but obviously the Vikings would have been there a lot earlier than that. Now, again, looking at this nice little chart, and if we sort of zoom in on it a little bit more, and there's something that I've done before, so I haven't got images of it for us today. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more. And interesting enough for those that are in South Wales is that what we do find is that we've got these little markings on here, and if we go to there, we go single coin finds, and it's got indications of burials here. I know where that burial site is there. It's near a place called Nash Lighthouse. And is it actually showing settlement sites? Well, there's one that really interests me there underneath there. It's known locally as the Atlantic Trading Estate, and I was actually on that excavation in the 1980s. It makes me feel old, but in the 1980s, and interestingly enough, there it was a site that was on the fringe. It was marginal land. It was the worst land possible for anyone to have a settlement, but nevertheless, the Vikings had a settlement there. When the site was excavated, they found large storage pits and hearths, and they even found a stone with a rune on it, some runic script on it. At the time, I thought somebody said it's a rood stone. I never knew what a rood stone was for about a decade, and then I realised that they said a rune stone with a rune on it. And so when we move up a little bit further north, again moving completely away, we go to this place up here, and it's mentioning all these little crosses, silver coins, and you've got a lot of coins from this period again being found. The Silverdale hoard, for example, Viking hoard, and you've got lots of evidence of Viking coins across the whole of Cumbria. So that's a nice little one, a nice little link there. And one thing that we do find, in particular with this part of the island, is a place known as Lambradrygoch. And at this place called Lambradrygoch, they've actually found evidence of Viking activity, a Viking settlement. So yeah, they were settling at different localities. For example, in Wales, and oh my God, look at that there. The Vikings seem to be everywhere in Merseyside. They seem to be Everton, Liverpool. Maybe they supported one of the local football teams back in the day, but they're everywhere up in the Merseyside area, and it's probably because there's been a lot more research going on. There's been a lot more development, and a lot more sites have been discovered. And this is a problem with archaeology, that
it's safe anchorage.
And there is safe anchorage, Pete, but there's another point I want to make, Pete. The reason why Pete's dead right, yeah, but there is other safe anchorage along the coastline of Wales. And the point I'm trying to make is that because we haven't got the intense developments that you see, for example, in Liverpool and Merseyside, they found more evidence from the Viking period. And that means that what we might understand about Wales and Pete's wordings of areas of safe anchorage are not readily visible because we haven't really done the excavation and research work. So that's the point. And what is really disappointing is Cumbria. Sorry, guys. What is really disappointing is Cumbria, because I don't really believe Cumbria has been as researched in the senses of archaeology as the rest of Britain's been researched. There should be a lot more Roman sites in Cumbria. There should be a lot more understanding of the Roman road network. You mentioned that earlier on. There should be when we were doing Cumbria, Cymru, Cornwall, and Orkney. What we were doing was a comparison class, and the biggest problem I had was when I was trying to compare Cumbrian evidence of sites with the rest of Britain. I really struggled, and it's probably because Cumbria has been massively under researched, and it's a shame really, because I think there's a great deal of wealth of archaeology under the surface, not just looking at the evidence of Roman sites in Cumbria, but Viking sites in Cumbria, and also this little enigma that I keep talking about and jesting about every other week when we're doing this type of subject of British archaeology. I mentioned about sometimes mention about place names. What do we know? Do we know much more about Cumbrian place names? What about an early Cumbrian language? Yeah, we know that sort of existed. What about what about the people who existed in Cumbria before the Normans got there? Well, what's all that about? You know, and this is something that really intrigues me. Missing history. And it's that missing history that we're talking about with the early medieval period. We know more about the Vikings in the whole of Britain than we know about much in the whole of Cumbria. And I remember living in Millom for a short while, and I just thought, there's nothing here. There's no archaeology here at all. And I just thought, there's a few stone circles up there, and I'm thinking, this can't be true. There's got to be more in Millom. And there's got to be more at Barrow and Furness. And you've got the Furness Abbey, for example. And you've got lots of little things. You've got lots of prehistoric stuff in and around Silverdale and Arnside and Grange and all those areas. There's got to be a lot more. And Cumbria, like Wales, has been very much under-researched. That's the point I wanted to make. Now, I was so lucky when I was doing my master's degree. I was so lucky to be taken around this site by my university supervisor, a lovely guy by the name of Simon Clark. And Simon's really nice guy, really genuine, love him to bits. And when Simon was a bit like me, he would challenge archaeology. He would say that this isn't right and that's not right, and so on. But he took us to this site at Giles Hoft, and what he said about Giles Hoft was that all of these buildings here are Viking buildings. This is one of the best Viking settlements surviving anywhere in Britain, and they do it really well on Shetland and Orkney, because when they excavate an archaeological site, they immediately start to conserve it. So you can see the tops of these walls. So what you do, you put a membrane across it, and that protects what's ever underneath it to keep stability into the wall. And you have a grass covering on it, and you nicely mow the grass. And when you're looking at an aerial view like this is a fascinating site. Maybe come back to Orkney again and Shetland. This is Shetland. This is an amazing site. And what you can see is the flagstones on the floor and a great hall here. And this is actually built. This is built directly in and around this building, which is actually a broch, an Iron Age broch. And then when this site is fallen out of use, in the Iron Age, into about 300-400, then you've got this wonderful Viking site above it, and then that site falls away, and then you've got this sort of this house from about the 1000s, 1100s, and you've got this big like hall area, and you've got a wonderful level of archaeology here. And what this tells you is that people have been living within this vicinity for a very long time. It's quite possible as well that whoever lived here, we're talking about the Picts of Shetland, for example. Where did they go? What happened to them? And if you want to talk about Picts and Orkney and Shetland, you think about what they say, and I've done this with Andy in depth. What we don't know is really what happened to the Picts on Orkney. We've probably got an idea of what was happening on Shetland. But suddenly, when the Vikings turned up on Orkney in the 600s, not the 700s, in the 600s, there was nobody there. Or was there anybody there? Did they kill all the Picts? Well, it's unlikely, but something happened on Orkney that caused the death of probably many Picts from some kind of disease. Vikings turned up to a basically empty, barren landscape, and they start building sites, such as the site at Burzay that we mentioned 2 weeks ago, when we looked at the picture art from the little bit of headland. It's a bit of an island actually, and on Burzay, which is on mainland Orkney. Now, so sort of little bit of a backdrop. And the backdrop is, I don't know why archaeology is obsessed with the following statement. But archaeologists seem to like roll over and say, right, we got the Angles and Saxons. We got the Vikings. And that's all there was. And I know I've already mentioned this at the beginning, but all the focus then seems to be on those people. And there's a danger with that because the subtext disappears. For example, when the Normans turn up in Cumbria, they start building these great tower houses like the one between Arnside and Silverdale. And then you just think, well, what was there before? So the one thing that I'm going to talk about now is really dramatic. The Vikings at Weymouth Harbour, the skulls and the human remains that we find at Weymouth Harbour are the remains of people who were defeated by these types of chappies. Well, these are actually more over costumes from Northumberland and maybe going over to the border into Scotland, because it's clearly got somewhat of a Pictish shield there. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that where you've got Vikings, you've got people. And when you've got people in the British context, you've got the Vikings. So there's this sort of interchange. And one thing that I've been trying to get across with my new book, again, for once, not a heavy sales piece, with my new book, is that Pax Britannia, not Pax Roman, because no matter how many Vikings there are, there's going to be more Anglo-Saxons, Britons, and Romans in Britain before the Vikings, right? So there's going to be all that sort of interchange. So it's nothing like the TV series, The Vikings. Again, these wonderful longships. Now, it does make me wonder what type of longships were around at the time of Sutton Hoo. But then again, we know what type of longships were around at the time of Sutton Hoo, because the Sutton Hoo ship burial is basically a Viking longship. But it's slightly a little bit less advanced than this example here. These sort of ocean-going vessels that we see dominate the mindset when we look at the Vikings in the British context. But are they the Vicky the Viking and everything of Hollywood? No. That there. Can you see them? Human remains. A pit of human remains. This is fascinating. And it's fascinating because I've got some information I want to read out, and I thought that's nice. And then I dug a little bit deeper, and I found a lovely article. Basically, I'm going to scroll it on the screen, and I'm going to show you the images, and we're just going to discuss the damage on the bones and stuff. So this paints a different perspective about these Vikings, very different. And actually, I jumped back in surprise with something else I'm going to tell you. Because near me, well, not near me, near Peter, actually, in the Vale of Glamorgan, there's a place called Llantwit Major, and there's a Roman site north of Llantwit Major called KARL-JAMES. And when that site was excavated, over 30 sets of human remains were found. And they were all very similar to this, decapitated. This is still Weymouth on the screen, but there was over 30 individuals that had been decapitated. And immediately, back in 1886, when they were excavating at KARL-JAMES, the archaeologist John Story immediately said, "This is evidence, is it not, of the local people being herded into a room, and they've been decapitated, and they were all male." And then he said, he gave us this tagline, that obviously the women and children were taken away and placed into slavery. And it was probably thought that it was from this period, you know, the 700s, right? But later on, years later, in the 1970s, they really looked at these bodies. And it turned out, through more recent dating methods as well, and analysis of strontium and all the rest of it, more recently, that the bodies weren't those of the locals. They were actually people from the north. They were raiders. They'd been herded into that room and decapitated. In other words, it wasn't the raiders who were taken off with the women and raping and pillaging. It was the local people that were capturing the raiders, beheading them, and the bodies just discarded inside a now disused Roman villa. Now, although these are not Viking burials, from KARL-JAMES, Landshut Major, they were very different from these people, who are in fact Vikings on the screen. But they were raiders from the north, probably sometime in the 400s. So we've always suffered from raiders and ships and things that go bump in the night. But in lots of cases, in regards to the likes of Alfred the Great, many years later, he defeated the Vikings himself. And these people defeated the Vikings at Weymouth as well. Very near Weymouth Harbour, actually. Let's have a little look where they are from. Let's see where we are. Hang on a minute. You can see all these images there. Near Weymouth Harbour is a site known as Ridgeway Hill, Viking burial pit. And the bodies were found associated with a widening of the main road. Look at that. They were widening it, and you know, there was a lot going on. And let's have a little look at the information. It was actually quite a small pit. So yeah, let's have a little look at the pit and see how many people are. There's the pit there. You can take some guesses how many people were actually buried there. But what we're going to do, we're going to go to my little notes, and let's have a little bit of fun with this one. The Ridgeway Hill Viking Burial Pit. So the Ridgeway Hill Viking Burial Pit near Weymouth, Dorset, was a mass grave of not 5, 30 people, as we see in Landshut Major. 54 skeletons and 51 heads of Scandinavian men executed sometime between AD 970 and 1025. Oh, Carl, weren't you supposed to be doing the earlier Viking evidence? But this is going to be the type of thing that we're going to find across the country, where Vikings don't have the upper hand. Not the Vikings of the films, right? These are Vikings who were overcome by the people they're attacking. The men are believed to have been Vikings executed by the local Anglo-Saxons. The dismembered skeletons were discovered by archaeologists in June 2009, and their identity and approximate age were later confirmed by forensic analysis. I can remember, because me and Andy were in the room when there was a press cut and then we discussed this. It was great, really interesting, but it's even more interesting today. Although the immediate circumstances of the deaths are unknown, well, the circumstances that they were beheaded, but what led to them being beheaded, the event occurred at a time of conflict between the native Anglo-Saxons and the other native people in the area as well, not forgetting them, the native Britons and the Romans who were still around as well, not just Anglo-Saxons, and the Viking raiders, invaders. And it has been suggested that the Vikings had been captured during an attempted raid into Anglo-Saxon territory. And the Anglo-Saxons had the upper hand. So, discovered in 2008, what the archaeologists didn't do, they didn't rush. They didn't say they're definitely the remains of Anglo-Saxons. They didn't do that. They decided to get some dates. And I tell you what, it's very difficult to work on human remains like this, because you can't connect, because it's such a charnel house of death. What I'm talking about is in modern day society. My grandmother passed away a couple of years ago, and all the focus was on my grandmother, and and as an archaeologist, I can probably focus on that. I can probably see the empathy of the loss and so on, and it's my grandmother at the end of the day. I wasn't thinking about her as a big pile of bones, but what I was trying to do is focus on my grandmother as a human being, even though she was no longer alive. But it's difficult to focus on the humanity of this, because there's no humanity in them being placed into the ground, because they've had their humanity taken from them, because they've been disinherited from their skulls. They've been disinherited from their place of being, because, for example, where does that skull there link with any of these bones? How do we match it all up? So those are really important points. So the beheading at this site, beheading somebody is an incredible act. It's something that I would probably in my lifetime not be doing myself. But if somebody broke into the house, I would have no alternative than to kill them. I could kill a human being, but I've got no idea what it would be like to kill 50 odd human beings for reasons other than the fact that they were prisoners. Obviously, if somebody breaks into your house, they deserve to die. That's fair enough. But these people have surrendered. They've given up, and there's over 50 of them, and it's trying to get into that, and it's trying to get your mind into that, and trying to get your mind into that as a working archaeologist. And it's not easy. You've got to close your eyes and you've got to work. And then you've got to try and put everything together. And the worst thing would be to be saying, right, these are Anglo-Saxons or Vikings. So it took a few years. It took one minute, Peter. It took a few years for the evidence to come out that these were actually Vikings. Pete.
All right, the heads were cut off, but the bodies would be whole. And when they were buried, how did all those bones get so badly mixed up? Not as whole bodies.
They are really badly mixed up, Pete, and
yes. But that wouldn't be until all the flesh had gone.
Pete, it's very likely. I'm gonna chuck it in there. I didn't expect that question. Your interpretation is completely correct. That is a real mess, and it is a real mess. Whether they were higgledy-piggledy just chucked in there as bits of rubbish, and that's how they're just so disembodied and just so disarticulated.
All the limbs must have been chopped off.
Or Pete, the body, it was just left open.
Possibly, yeah.
And to be honest with you, the most you're talking, Pete, you're talking about a period when nudity is very important, right? So say for example, you would not see a woman naked. You would not see for example, if you might strip a man naked, but you wouldn't strip a woman naked, right? Whatever she had done, you wouldn't take her clothes off her. But depending on and being Anglo-Saxon Christians, it is quite likely as well that they would have had a sense of modesty. However, these are animals. I didn't say that, but to the Anglo-Saxon, these are animals. These are barbarians. This is the scum of scum. These are the pagans. These are inhuman beings. Let's take their clothes off, toss them in the pit. I don't care if the dogs ravish their limbs and take away their private parts and take morsels out of them. These are nothing but dogs themselves. Throw them into the pit and let Mother Nature have a bath. We're not going to even bother filling these bodies over with earth, right? And that brings us back to another important point, Pete. Very important point. When you look at Varus, the Teutoburg forest. When we look at Varus, we look at the Roman legionaries, thousands of them just being left naked in the open in the Teutoburg forest. We have that from descriptions 5-10 years later when the Roman military went in there to try and retrieve some of the bodies and to bury them. Now, the thing is, when we the bodies were just left naked, so that there's a sense when you take somebody's clothing off a man in particular, you would never do this with a woman. You'd never have a naked woman there. Maybe you might, but but these are all male. If a similar thing had happened to the women, the bodies would need to be covered up. But men treated differently. And it's inhumane to be stripped of your clothes, and it's inhumane to have your head cut off, and it's inhumane for your body to be chucked into a pit, and it's totally inhumane for animals to be pecking out your eyeballs, and dogs to be ravishing your bodies into bits and to be disarticulated. Let's have a little look. I don't think anyone ever expected this lecture today, but this is what we're doing. So basically, the site was excavated in 2008. It was routinely being worked on in 2009 by Oxford Archaeology. Began excavating land along the route of the planned Weymouth Relief Road in advance of a project that nearly reached £100 million, which was intended to improve access to Weymouth and the Isle of Portland in advance of the 2012 Summer Olympics. No wonder! The project had attracted significant controversy as the route passes through a legally protected area of outstanding natural beauty. There is of historical and ecological importance back then. Nothing's changed, has it? The HS2 will just chuck it through scheduled protected ancient monuments and triple SA conservation areas and so on. So the archaeological excavation was one of the largest carried out in Dorset for many years, covering an area. In total, they excavated. So if we have a little look at that image again, let's just go back again. Let's just sort of have a quick look. This was an extension. This whole area here is being geophysed and excavated and surveyed. An area of 50,000 square meters. It's quite a big area for archaeologists to be excavating, isn't it? The archaeologists discovered a burial pit on Ridgeway Hill containing what turned out to be 54 dismembered skeletons and 51 skulls. The bodies had been thrown into the pit haphazardly, but the severed heads had been piled up separately to one side. The pit was in a disused Roman quarry used by the killers for convenience rather than specifically dug for the purpose. It lay next to what was a main road back in the day and parish boundary in Anglo-Saxon times. Such prominent locations were typically used for public executions. As the burial pit was just outside the main construction area of the relief road, the archaeologists were able to excavate it in detail over the course of. It didn't take a week to excavate that. It didn't take 3 weeks. It took 3 months to excavate that site properly without significantly disrupting the road project. So the archaeologists had time to excavate the site properly and to really understand it and to really understand the disarticulation and the word that I need to use, tragedy. So moving on again, let's just see where we go. Look at that there. Pulling the Vikings' hair and throwing their heads to the side and just tossing them in. I think for artist impression that they are being given loincloths, but I would possibly say that the loincloth would be as valuable, and let's just get rid of the loincloth. To be honest with you, we know that the Nazis did this. They stripped people naked, took all their clothes off them. And, you know, that happened. So, you know, clothing, linen, or whatever these Vikings were wearing would have been far more valuable back in the day. And this is an important issue, important area. So, again, if we go back again and sort of go back to this pit, let's get into my notes. So the human tragedy is as follows. The 54 skeletons were all of males. Well, that makes sense. But the tragedy is almost all aged from their late teens to around 25 years old. Most of these were inexperienced, with a handful of older individuals aged up to their 50s. But the tragedy is that most of these were teenagers. But then again, I'm saying that a teenager is more important than somebody in their 50s. I'm not actually saying that. I'm saying that these are teenagers. They've not lived. They're inexperienced. They probably thought, oh Christ, we've been overrun by these Anglo-Saxons and we'll all surrender and hopefully good things will happen to us. Those in their 50s probably knew something different. They had all been killed at the same time with a large, very sharp weapon such as a sword. And the interesting thing as well is that sword would have needed to have been sharpened every few blows. So you can imagine you're cutting through somebody's neck, and maybe you don't cut through it properly the first time, and you might miss, and you might get the scapula, for example. You cut through it. So and also the other thing as well is a sword is going to be blunted with the vertebra bone eventually. So you can imagine, right, we're going to sharpen the sword, boys, girls. Next, they had not been cleanly killed. They had not been cleanly killed, as many of them had suffered multiple blows to the vertebra, jawbone, and skull. So in other words, you know, you can imagine that if a jawbone, for example, some of them might have been hit from frontwards, so that's going to hit the jawbone, and it's hit the jaw. So these guys are in bloody agony, almost thinking, just get on with it, you know, get on with it, and they've got to give it another go. And the agony of these men would have been unbelievable. It's not clean. We don't see clean evidence of death within the archaeology. One man had his hands sliced through. So in other words, he may have been trying to protect, and you know, his hands have gone, and then they've done it again. Or he may have been like this, or like this, protect. And anyway, suggesting that he had attempted to grab the sword as it was being swung towards him. There were a total of 188 wounds visible on the skeletons. So 54 skeletons, that's an average of 3 and a bit wounds per skeleton. So in other words, these guys had, you know, had the mill thrown at them. An average of 4 per individual. So in other words, maybe they swung at these people more than 2 or 3 times to try and get the job done, indicating that they had been the victims of severe violence before being killed. One man had the top of his skull sliced off, exposing his brain. If you cut somebody's skull off in the right way, the person could still be alive. There may well have been more injuries to soft tissue, but this is not detectable from the skeletons. However, they had no obvious battle wounds and were most likely captives. So in other words, they had surrendered. Do you know, in history, I've always wondered why people surrender when they know that they're going to be, when there's even the idea that this is going to happen. Why not fight to the death? There's no evidence that any of these real evidence that these actually fought at all. Judging from the lack of any remains of clothing or other possessions, they had probably been naked when they were thrown into the pit. There are more bodies than skulls, suggesting that 3 of the heads, perhaps of high-ranking individuals, were kept as souvenirs or put on stakes as warnings. The executions were initially thought to have occurred around the time of the Roman conquest of Britain. You see, this is the point. It's so good that this news didn't come out back in 2008, 2009. They waited until 2012. The archaeologists thinking, one thing we don't have is datable evidence. So this has got to be evidence of a Roman massacre. And you know what? It's got to be evidence of a Roman massacre of local people. But it didn't turn out to be that way. Radiocarbon dating changed all that. And the remains found that they dated to sometime between AD 970 to 1025. So never always jump to these assumptions. And after all, they can't be Vikings, can they? The Vikings wouldn't have been overcome like this, but they were Vikings. And that's what all the dating evidence and all the other analysis told us. Analysis of teeth from 10 of the skeletons were carried out by isotope geoscience laboratory. So the isotope, strontium isotope was isolated and analysed. And this found that the men had come from Scandinavia, with one thought to have come from north of the Arctic Circle. And had eaten a high-protein diet comparable with human remains found at known sites in Sweden. So in other words, an Inuit-type person. And he ended up dying down here. What a terrible fate. It makes you wonder why this is happening, or why this was really the case. Chemical evidence from the bones indicated that they had eaten diets of mixed geographical origin, so from a number of different localities throughout Scandinavia, suggesting that they had migrated around Northern Europe. Their physical features were also very similar to Scandinavian populations of the time, and the physique of some of them indicated that they were possibly warriors. What other reason is that they would have been here in the first place? One man had filed grooves into his front central upper incisors, a possible indication of warrior status that had been observed in Scandinavian burials. However, the men were not all in good physical condition, as we will see after the break. One had suffered from a painful and disabling a suppurating leg wound. Nice. Suppurating leg wound since childhood, which would have significantly slowed him in his group. Another had a deformed right leg as a result of a fractured femur. So suppurating leg wound is the one that we've already seen. But Pete was right. When you can get similar evidence when you look at a femur from the other individual. The dead men were all of fighting age and were killed a long way from home. Several theories have been advanced for how they ended up at Ridgeway Hill. At the time of the deaths, England was the scene of conflict between the native peoples and invading Vikings. It was initially suggested that men might have been Saxons killed by Vikings or by other Saxons. Of course, this is what I said, This is what would have been thought 60, 70 years ago. But no, that's not the case. But this was disproved by the evidence of their Scandinavian origins. The site of the burial is thought to have been a formal spot, and it's possible the excavations may have taken place in front of an audience, a gathered audience. In the National Geographic documentary Viking Apocalypse, it has been suggested that the executions may have been linked to the St. Brice's Day massacre or that the Viking men were executed by their own kind for defection. So in other words, what is the St. Brice's Day massacre? That'd be interesting. St. Brice's Day massacre was the killing of Danes in the Kingdom of England on the 13th of November in the year 1002. And guess what? Mark it well. Friday the 13th. The Order of the Knights Templars was dissolved on Friday the 13th. It seems that Friday the 13th is unlucky for many people. In response to Friday the 13th in the year 1307, and this was Friday the 13th of the 13th of November 1002, which occurred maybe to these Danish. In response to the frequent Danish raids, King Aldred ordered the execution of all Danes living in England. Bloody hell. Although evidence is lacking, the skeletons of 34 to 38 men aged between 16 and 25 found during the excavation at another location, St. John's College, Oxford, in 2008, may be the remains of some of the victims of this massacre. But we're not sure if these are the remains of that said massacre, like those other bodies to be found in Oxford. So let's what I'd like to do is probably have a break now, because I'm quite poofed. So again, we're probably not gonna get to the last thing that I wanted to do. They've reconstructed some of these bodies, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at this after the break. Okay, and there it is again. I'm just gonna see. So I'm not sure we're gonna get to this. But what I'd like to do now is ask if there's any questions, and we're going to look at the article associated with these. So let's see if there's any questions. And hang on a minute. Oh, stop sharing. Good. Right, go for it. Any questions? Do you know, you guys have been as good as gold tonight. There's been no Roger interfering with Drina, and Claire hasn't been interfering with Dave. There's been none of that. So nothing.
One minute the the Vikings were terrible people, raping and pillaging, killing all the monks, raping the women, did terrible, terrible things. And then we hear, well, they wanted to settle, they needed land. They had a surplus of young men that needed wives, and this was the reason they came. So there's a lot of different points of view. But to have such a dreadful massacre, some terrible things must have been witnessed over a long period, surely.
Now that's an important point. Are these all from one moment in time? Now that's you know, Peter's point that they're disarticulated is a rather interesting one. Were they all from the same day? Now that's an important point. We're not going to answer that one, but I think you've actually got the answer to your own questions there, because the archaeology. Let's not ignore the history, but ignore the history for answering your questions. Mm-hmm. So what you can clearly tell is that there are Vikings over here who are massacred. Mm. You've got archaeological evidence of settlements on marginal land in South Wales and in North Wales. Why are they on marginal land? They must have been sort of desperate to settle somewhere, right? Mm. Is it just about young men? Because these young men were associated with another event, right? And then you look at York, and you look at Coppergate, and you look at the Jorvik Viking Centre and the Vikings in York, and then you start to see that the Vikings were great silversmiths. Why do you find the Silverdale hoard, for example? Because that was destined to be melted down for a silversmith. So that's the archaeological evidence. So you've got the answer, Margaret, to your own question. You don't need to be confused, because you know the evidence says more than the archaeology. Who's writing? Start again. The evidence of the archaeology says more than the history. That's what I should have said. The archaeology says more than the history. Glad I recorrected myself there, because it's been very confusing. And because when we look at Lindisfarne, what we do see is at Lindisfarne, it says about a French guy is writing about the harrying from the north and the raping and the pillaging at Lindisfarne in January in the year 793. But that person was writing a long distance away. Who wrote the history? It wasn't the Vikings who wrote the history. By King Canute's reign in 1016, 1016. King Canute's reign in 1016. By his reign, the idea of the Vikings in Britain had been sanitized. And then who does the writing of the history? The Normans write the history, who are in fact Vikings themselves, but then they don't see themselves as Vikings. They see themselves as Normans. So the people actually writing the history are actually the victors and not the Vikings themselves. So, you know, it's a bit like the best metaphor for this is the politician Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill started off as a Liberal member of Parliament. He ended up as a Conservative MP, and then he would ridicule his origins as a Liberal Party MP to his very deathbed. But the fact of the matter is, if you really look into history and archaeology, you can see things that paint the final analysis of the victor to be very different than actually what happened.
You know, they recently checked the DNA of the population of York, and it was something like 80% was Viking, as mine is as well.
Yeah,
And
you're
many-
just showing off.
And apparently they took many women from Cumbria over to Iceland, and they went willingly. How they know they went willingly, I don't know.
All the women from
Sandra had her DNA tested, and she was part Viking.
Yes, same as me.
and she comes up from up north, and she's got a hairy chest. It says it all.
So the Vikings are living on in many parts of Britain.
Exactly.
So like the Celts.
Oh. Right. Okay. So what we're going to do now? We'll have a little break. I know we started off a bit late. We'll have a little break, and the next bit will be fine. So let's just have a 10-minute break, and that's fine. So I'll speak to you in a minute. Okay. See you then.
Yeah.
Let's. Here we go. She'll start. Yeah. Cheers. And you've really screwed things up now, because people have got to do extra things, and Pete's not used to twiddling with his knobs. Anyway, so what I'm going to do now, we'll just look at a couple of those images to just get us back into this last bit. And I've got a whole article I'm going to show you. So again, what we were talking about this burial pit, and the article is based on this. Putting some, obviously, trying to put together all these sets of human remains isn't easy. And notice there's no head. I'm sure they obviously matched the skulls with the bodies, but you obviously had 3 heads missing. And so obviously the bodies left must indicate that they must have been that's you could possibly work that one out, couldn't you? So anyway, we're going to go through this article actually showing cut marks to the skull, and it's quite likely if somebody's going to be cutting your head off, you're going to try and move your skull out the way, aren't you? So you know these things happen. And obviously the bone that we mentioned. Back to this image, and then what I'd like to do is have a look at this article, and just it would help, Carl, if I had the article in front of us. Let's try and get this one on. Hang on a minute, let's just make sure. Oh, here it is. Let's just share this now. There you go. Right, this group of executed Vikings were inexperienced raiders with oozy, smelly pus. Now I thought that was a really nice little article, but to be honest with you, this, you know, when we do articles and I read them out, there's lots of images. This is dating from 2016, and there's one of the scientists putting. Usually, what they do and I can remember they had they did this. They found a load of bodies in York, and they hired an aircraft hangar, and they had like 30 to 40 tables. And by the way, this limb goes with this one. Oh no, that goes with that one. So you're going to need a big space to arrange the bodies. And obviously some really nice detail with the lower extremities. Really, it's just the upper half of the bodies that's got the damage. So the mass grave discovered containing executed Vikings, the discovery of 50 plus young male skeletons decapitated and lumped in an old Roman quarry on an Olympic Relief Road in Weymouth 5 years ago became an even more gripping story following scientific examination revealed that the mass grave carried executed Vikings. Well, we know that. But this is thrilling. I would go with that, thrilling. And here we go. Angus Campbell. I couldn't even say it. Campbell. Shut up. The then leader of Dorset County Council, who is now the county's Lord Lieutenant, admitted organisers never would have dreamed of finding a Viking war grave. Now, this isn't just one body. This is a number. Such is the significance of this burial that a book given to the ground has just been published, written by some of the experts involved. Meanwhile, the British Museum's major 2014 Norse exhibition, the first in more than 30 years to be held on Vikings there, altered its layout to include some of the skeletons. Great. So it's a major find. The individuals are thought to have been executed at the graveside and stripped of their clothes. Well, the easiest way is to strip everybody of their clothes. When you strip everybody of their clothes, it makes you very vulnerable. You know, it makes you very vulnerable when you're stripped. When you've got clothes on, you can I don't know, it gives you a little bit more dignity. But when you've got no clothes on, you're wondering, you know, well, let's not be silly, and you're going to put your hands on your nether regions. You're going to think, well, I got nowhere to, I can't do anything because everybody can see where my arms are. So with defense wounds on their hands, arms, and skulls, and injuries to their neck and shoulders, suggesting a bloodbath in which several blows were required to remove each head. So there we go, and we can see that there there's damage that's been sliced in there. So you've got the cut mark on the top of the cranium there, and that side of the skull has been sliced through as well. So, you know, probably if you didn't want to suffer anymore, just let this get over and done with. So another skull, another bit of damage to the skull as well. And obviously this is just one skull with all this damage, and that itself is as a point of death. Several sword blows were apparently needed to sever some of the heads. This is what we're saying. And again, back to that image. Curiously, many of the individuals had suffered from infections and physical impairments. Now, that's interesting. Yeah, it was Margaret who mentioned earlier on about what could have been happening, is that these are lads that needed to sort of sow their seed and sort of meet a wife abroad, but lots of these had physical and probably mental problems, and they had been put into a situation where they were unable to defend themselves, and all the way from Scandinavia. Now, in my mind, I thought this sort of thing slavery, but you don't think about Viking slaves. And Margaret, put that in your head, and we'll leave it there. A spectacular example on display at the British Museum is one individual who had osteomyelitis, chronic bone infection. So we've seen that involving his thigh bone. Chronic osteomyelitis, chronic bone infection. So the bone would have seeped. The marrow rotting, it would have seeped. It would have been quite icky. His thigh bone. And the other thing as well is, we'll go to that thigh bone as well. Let's just go back to that thigh bone as well. I know this article says about the thigh bone as well, but that that seeping point has actually healed over, and the bones just thought, right, we'll just ooze out gunge for the rest of this person's life, and that's sort of what's going on. So the bone was twice the size of a normal thigh bone and had openings which would have oozed smelly pus during his life. I can't imagine what that would have been like. I can't imagine it. But the interesting thing as well is the person must have been able to walk on that limb, and that's interesting in itself. The leg would have been swollen and painful. It must have posed a considerable, hang on, here we go, a considerable disability to the individual and consequently the rest of the group. Other examples of impaired mobility or limb usage were also evident. So there was a deformed right leg caused by a fracture to the femur and a collarbone fracture. Bladder or kidney disease was also evident by a stone found amongst the disarticulated bones, a kidney stone. Amazing, yeah, finding a kidney stone. So, here we go. That's a damaged that's a damaged vertebra, and it's deliberately filed teeth have been a common find in Scandinavia, but were unknown until now in Britain. So there was examples of that. So what we've got a vertebra that's been cut through. That there is where that's been cut through by a sword. So it is directly cut through the back of the neck, gone through. That's it. Remember that if you have to have more than one blow, you're still alive. And look at that though. Dentists may oh, here we go. It's gone straight through here as well. I think, yeah, this is a mandible. So you've got the lower mandible. So how this is being done. So I described it that the person was on the front, and because we've got damage to those molars, haven't we? But again, there's so much damage to these bones. There really is. The full story, as the findings surmise, is hardly the picture of an elite group of Viking warriors, and that's the point that I've been making all along. This is not the Vikings of Hollywood, is it, Margaret? This is not. Living between 970 and 1025 under the rule of Athelred the Unready or Canute the Great, chemical dental analysis suggests their members. If it was Canute the Great, then that would obviously be in the reign of King Canute, who was a Viking. Chemical analysis suggests their bands came from the Arctic and subarctic regions of Norway, Sweden, Iceland, and the Baltic states, Belarus, and Russia, with the youngest in his early teens and the oldest over 50. So you can imagine that the oldest in his 50s should have known better than to have put these individuals in this position. And the youngest wouldn't have had a clue. The youngest would have followed his lead. He would have said, it would have said, right, strip down, everybody. So the youngest would have known. The youngest wouldn't have known why he was stripping down, but the 50-year-old would have. That they're all going to be executed. Various surprises come courtesy of their intentional teeth decorations. There is direct evidence of deliberate modifications of the body that rarely survive in archaeological records. All of them were made in more or less the same area of the teeth in all of the individuals, and in several cases the furrows were identical, even though the skeletons were from different parts of Sweden. So it's not actually showing you any teeth there. Modifying teeth in this way may have been undertaken for the same reason that we chose to have tattoos today. There's that bone as well. There it is. So you might be able to see that may have been the result of a fractured healing, but it may have been the result of just a bone disorder in itself.
Could have been an ulcer.
That just got bigger and bigger.
Mm.
Yeah. but you can actually see two other here. And what it is, the bone is actually swelling as well. It's massively, it's very friable, that bone, of cause of the event of what's going on inside the bone where it's oozing out the pus.
Is it possibly cancer?
Mm.
And why not? Do you know what, right? We've got a human bone that we're still analysing, and it's of a femur that's half, well, a third, the circumference of this. And basically there's a bone growth on it sticking out from the bone. It's really weird. Very, very strange. Anyway, again, looking at that skull, more than 90 similar filings have been found on Scandinavian skeletons during the past 9 years. In all cases, one or both of the medial incisors showing filing marks, and in a third of the cases, these were also found on the lateral incisors. So in other words, lots of carvings on the teeth. Most of the individuals had 2 or 3 furrows carved into the teeth. Given the depth and precision of the filing marks, they are likely to have been created by a skilled person, although the modification behind their creation is unclear. The associated archaeological context and finds do not provide any clues. They may have been created in reference to a person's occupational status, or they may simply have been a pure decoration within the teeth. Small, quite broadly, to show off their grills, talking about their teeth. The National Geographic Channel carried an hour-long Viking apocalypse special on the graves, with more than 7,000 people attempting to deduce why the Vikings were in Dorset during an exhibition held in Dorchester in 2010. So there you go. That's a lot more clearer image, actually. So obviously they're excavating there over 3 months, and no wonder, because you're going to have to take care on that. And again, we've seen these. So obviously the grave excavated. One indisputable conclusion is that these victims bore a more fragile mortality than the mightiness usually associated with the Vikings. Again, said that a second time. Several individuals had suspected brucellosis. What's that? Anyone out there?
Brucellosis.
Brucellosis.
What is that?
Binding of the teeth. I don't know.
I don't know what that is.
No.
It's something from cows, isn't it? Like
It says there, but it doesn't make it clear. A highly contagious infectious disease that is passed from animals to humans, either by the ingestion of unsterilized milk or meat, or by coming into close contact with secretions from infected animals. But
Smallpox was.
yeah, like cowpox or something like that. I
Yeah.
thought it
Oh
was.
yeah, smallpox. Yeah. Cowpox.
Right. Okay. These diseases and injuries provided a very tangible link to these individuals. Many of us will have come across these conditions, especially kidney stones, or know of people who have suffered from them today, and therefore can relate to the pain and discomfort they can cause. They reveal a more human side to the Vikings that has not really been revealed before. The diseases are consistent with peasant status individuals, coupled with the fact that the skeletons showed little evidence of previous battle injuries. It does not fulfill ideas of an elite Viking fighting group, although an inexperienced group of raiders is conceivable. So there's the teeth.
Mm.
When you think about it, you can see that, but it's not. They're not exactly. It's not exactly breamingly showing, is it? I don't know. Obviously, maybe each person in a tribe had in a group had this done to identify them as part of that group. It's difficult to say, isn't it?
Mm.
It really is. Elements of the exhibition include the skeletons. Here we go. Eventually returning them to... Elements of the exhibition, including the skeletons, will move to the Museum of Prehistory and Early History in Berlin between September and the start of next year, eventually returning to a new £350,000 ancient Dorset gallery at the Dorset County Museum, where they will be returned to their original positions around a reconstruction burial pit. Until then, their latest high-profile exposure is in London. Right, okay, they're burying them in right. That's interesting. It'd be nice to see an image of that. We had. Hang on, oh God, we just missed the last bit there. We had already begun planning the exhibition when news broke about the discovery of the Weymouth mass graves. They had to have it in the British Museum. Not only is it one of the most dramatic Viking finds of recent years, it is particularly important in providing a very different perspective to the usual view of Viking military success in England in that period. Given to the ground is the book, A Viking Age Mass Grave at Ridgeway Hill, Dorset, is available at the British Museum and online. So I just wanted to bring you something different tonight. We're going to have to finish now because of time and stuff. Again, back to these teeth. There you go. With the filings on the teeth. That would really weaken your teeth, wouldn't it? Open to tooth decay and all sorts of things. But other than that, I'm going to ask, are there any questions to finish with?
No. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Andy's gone.
It's not, is it?
No, he's not. It's just his picture that's gone.
Oh, silly
Still
sod. Right. Okay. It's usually David that goes early. If I ask David questions now, he does his question bit and he goes. You see. Bet you happens. David, any questions?
No, thank you.
Okay, then, David. I got to say goodbye to David before anyway. See you, David. See you next week. But we're just doing our questions, Dave. So stay with us till the end. Pete, anything you'd like to say?
Well, yeah, Thursday I'm giving a talk on Milford Haven. And Milford Haven was known to be the site where as many as 50 Viking ships would overwinter. And the village there is known as Hubbardston and is named after the Viking Jarl of Hubbard.
Jarl being a lord or a leader.
Jarl
Exactly.
being a leader, yes.
As in Jarl's Hoft, the place in Scotland. Good link there, Pete. Well done on Shetland. Jarl's Hoft. Right. Yes. Yeah. Pete's on for the Orkney trip. Drina.
No questions. Thank you very much.
What'll happen, right? Pete doesn't know this, right? What he'll do, he'll drive all the way up to Orkney. You can all jump in his camper van. He'll drive you up there. So it's ideal. Margaret, anything you'd like to say, love?
Well, it's just surprising that there isn't more evidence of Viking settlements, etc., in Cumbria, because so many of the local towns have Viking names.
Yes.
So they were definitely here in force.
Exactly.
Would they not have been just part of the community then?
Do you know what? It's
Yeah, could be.
This is a difficult one because we always hear about the expulsion of the Vikings from Dublin, and we don't really. This is one of the strange things. It's different when we look at the Isle of Man, and it's different when we look at Shetland and Orkney. The Vikings never left, but they were at some point kicked out of York. Now, if that was everyone kicked out of York, and if you're talking about the DNA, some of these, the way the Vikings are treated is very different. For example, we didn't kick the Anglo-Saxons out, did we? Do you know what I mean? So that's an interesting one, but very, very strange that. Annie Panny, anything?
No, that was interesting as always. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we all know that fiver worked earlier on for you to say that. We've done Drina, haven't we? I think.
Yeah,
Many
many times.
Hey.
Dear.
Oh, you've let the cat out of the bag there, Drina. Flippin' heck. But Drina, we always take precautions. That's what I'd like to add, if anyone's watching.
Get her on the telly and she's off. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Do you know what? I could do one of these famous person expose thing. I could make a fortune from this.
Kiss and tell. Yeah.
Exactly. Very quiet housewife from Arnside has dark secrets in her closet with minstrel boy from Barry. And talking about Barry boys, Andy, anything you'd like to say, lovely?
I did looking at the reports of the medical condition of those guys. It sounds like they were kind of fairly disabled and therefore would have been an easy target.
But why were they there in the first place? It's like sending.
Yeah.
I kind of wonder whether they were just on the way somewhere else. I mean, it's quite late on in the Viking period as well,
Yes, it
isn't it?
is,
When they
it
were
is.
more settling rather than raiding anyway.
Yes.
So
Very interesting one.
Very cruel.
maybe they've been bad lads and got caught somewhere.
But that was horrendous, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
but bad lads with disability, and I don't. It's a really weird one. That it's a really
Why
weird
have
one.
those Vikings behind you all got black hair when they're being blondies?
Because they're from Barry.
The
Oh God, it just fell off.
tell you what is interesting is also is that they're that far south. You know the Danegeld line was much further north than that, so maybe they weren't appreciated down south.
Or maybe they didn't want people with disability hanging around. That could have been the reason why they were killed.
Yeah. Or maybe, like they suggested, that they were actually slaves and just butchered.
Yeah.
You wonder about the mentality of the perpetrators, doesn't it? Really?
I think they were. Yeah, I think they were all like that.
Very organized. The Vikings.
Yeah.
And they had diplomacy amongst them, and they would have what is known as the thing, when the leader would speak and allow others within the group to speak if they had disagreements, etc. And they could sort out things like that. And they sorted these things out without violence.
No, you're right.
They had what is known as the speaker stone, and the person who held the stone was the speaker at the time, and he could pass the stone to anyone else to speak.
You're right. They had to be quite diplomatic because they traveled so far to so many places in very small numbers and came back. Otherwise, they'd have just been massacred, or captured or imprisoned.
Diplomacy. So we might be talking about a eugenic, ethnic cleansing type thing going on here.
Yeah,
it might be something like that. And but the thing is, I got to make this point. Women were the hierarchy in this society. So could you imagine getting a stone off a woman? She would never allow anyone else to speak.
Wait a minute. I don't do all the speaking, and you don't. Most of there's more of you men talking all the time than us women, I think.
Sorry.
Sorry. No, hang on. We've got an excuse for this. This isn't a female Viking society. This is a British society.
And if you were smart, you'd have a spare stone in your pocket.
Exactly. Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I can imagine that now. This is, yeah.
No, this is the stone.
Yeah, but you've been speaking for 4 hours. Yeah, but it's still the same stone. Yeah, but he's got it. No, he's that's not the real stone. I got the real stone. And I'm a woman, and I know.
I've got a bag of gravel. Will that do?
Let's go to stoning. We went to stoning last week, Mum.
Yeah. Are there any women here, are there?
Any women here? No. I'm Brian, and so's my wife. Oh, it's so brilliant, isn't it? And he says, "You're all individuals. I'm not."
Yeah.
Oh God. On that note, we'll call it a day, and I'll see you all next week. And I'm just gonna quickly tell you what we're doing next week. And
all right then.
All right, hang on a minute. Where's the bloody hell is my post-it note in here? Oh, for God's sake! I know we're doing Turkey next week, but I can't remember where in Turkey.
Oh, there's a lot in Turkey.
Another civilization.
Hang on a minute. Hang on. It is Turkey next week, but I can't find my post-it note. Right, okay. Yeah, another civilization, not a British civilization in Turkey. We are in Turkey next week. Sorry to be so vague. But that's where we're going next week. Again. Sorry. We do a lot of Turkey. Other than that, are there any questions? Any further questions before we finish? No? All right,
no, thanks.
Okay, no. David's gone without saying goodbye. He's done it again. As soon as I turn my back, he's done it again. He's a very naughty boy. Okay, then I'm going to leave you be, guys, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks for the patience tonight. You have a great weekend, and Peter, obviously you've got Wednesday evening. For the rest of you, see you next week. Take care.
Yes.
Okay,
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye,
My
everybody.
pleasure. Bye. Bye bye. No, no,
Bye.
no, no. Bye bye. Bye bye. Bye bye. Bye bye. He's a very naughty boy. He's a very naughty boy. Well, that's it. Hopefully.